Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining the part three of the epilepsy workshop. We're delighted to have you here. And as always, this is meant to be an interactive workshop. So at any time, please jump in with any comments or questions. And yeah, yes. So I put the slides. Yeah, I put the slides, and Sarah put the slides in the chat. And this is the aggregated slide deck for all of the epilepsy workshops that we've held to date. This is part three, and so we are on slide 101. And I'm hoping that we'll get through all this content today. We won't have to convene you all for a part four. This has been a really great process for me, and hopefully for all of you, going through the epilepsy branch of the Mondo disease ontology. I'm not going to do any background about Mondo. Hopefully, we're all up to speed on this already. If you haven't heard a lot about Mondo, the recordings for the previous workshops are available. And let me get the slides on our website. And there's one of the slides. There's a link to the website. So yeah, we're just going to dive in today with the hope of getting through the final content. And yeah, I'll be facilitating the workshop today along with my colleague Sabrina Toro, who's the lead bio-creator for the Mondo disease ontology. I'm part of I'm part of the Mondo disease ontology. I'm currently the associate director for the critical path at the Critical Path Institute for the data science team in the Department of the DCC department. And so yeah, we use Mondo at Critical Path to annotate data. We get individual patient data from rare epilepsies, and we share it in our data sharing platform and make it available to researchers under different governance guidelines upon request. And so we're using Mondo for annotating diseases, and it is really important for us to make sure that the representation of the epilepsy diseases are correctly represented. And new classifications have been published in the literature with the International League Against Epilepsy, and we have been working towards aligning with the classifications from the ILAE. So this is, yeah, like I said, this is a part three of our workshop. We've had really great discussions in the last two workshops that we held in the fall of last year. And I'm hoping we can get through the remaining open questions that we have. Turns out epilepsy is very complicated. So there's been a lot of questions that have come up, and it's just super valuable to have convene experts like you from the community to get the input from you and make sure that we're representing the epilepsy disease entities in the way that the community sees them and the clinical community uses these disease names and entities. So yeah, let's continue on with our efforts. So yeah, so just to remind you, we have a code of conduct. This was sent out with invitations. Hopefully everybody's seen this. If not, this is linked in the slide deck that was shared with you in the chat. And then first we'll just go around and introduce ourselves so we know who's here today and what expertise everybody has. And then we'll dive into going through we still are working through some of the top level classifications from the ILAE. And then there's some specific terms that have come up in the work we've been doing that we have questions about. So with that, and then we will plan to stop at 10 minutes before the hour. We'll have almost 2 hours to get together, but try to finish before the top of the hour just to give us all a break between our many meetings that I'm sure we all have today. Oh, and absolutely, you're absolutely welcome to download these slides. Feel free to reuse any of these slides in any context. Just please give us the attribution for them. Is all we ask. So yes, our goals are to continue looking at the upper level classification of the epilepsy disease branch and aligning with the International League Against Epilepsy. And then, like I said, there's some key terms of interest that I have particular questions about. And with that, I think we're going to be really close to having a really well represented classification of epilepsy once we've discussed all these terms and then we get the changes implemented. I think timeline wise, I foresee being able to do this probably in the next couple of months. We release Mondo every month. So after our discussions today, I'll have a couple of weeks to implement some changes for the February release, but likely they'll bleed over into the March release. optimistically, we'll aim to get these changes in by the March release. And then the next step after that, we are going to create kind of a feedback system that's a kind of like a form-based feedback system. So there'll be the opportunity to continue to provide feedback to the classifications of the epilepsy terms in a kind of a more asynchronous manner. We'll be sending out information about that sometime after we've done the initial reclassifications, probably like in the spring. And then we also intend to write a community-based manuscript describing the outcomes of this workshop. So this is something we'll get started on as soon as we wrap up these online sessions and get the changes implemented. And all of you will be invited to be co-authors. Anybody else from the community, if you know any other experts in this field or anyone interested in epilepsy or ontology development that you think might want to join the effort to write the manuscript, they are welcome. You don't have to have attended these sessions to contribute to the manuscript. We want to make it as open as possible. Anyone who wants to contribute to the writing is welcome. So yes, just to remind you all, for those who are new to the session, to the workshop, we are working towards aligning our representation of the Mondo epilepsy disease entities with the ILAE, the International League Against Epilepsy. And an interesting point came up at the last workshop. We learned that the ILAE is not the Bible, and this is a representation that has come together by this group of folks, of epilepsy experts who agreed upon this representation of epilepsy entities, but there has been some feedback given to them and discussions that maybe it's not the 100% agreed upon approach to how to represent epilepsy. So we're using this as a guide and then taking input from all of you to revise the representations and classifications where necessary. So that was really interesting to hear and really helpful to hear. Sabrina and myself and the other Mondo curators, we're not epilepsy experts, so we usually go to the literature for guidance as to how to best represent this information, but then also convening folks like you is really invaluable to get input from you and learn more about how epilepsy is represented in the community and how these terms are used in the actual practice. So we are trying to align with this as we see fit based on your feedback. So we've reviewed a lot of different aspects of this so far. The seizure types we considered phenotypes, so we didn't really focus on that. We aligned Mondo with the epilepsy types that are in ILAE. So now we have focal, generalized, combined generalized, and focal. And we talked about adding some kind of unknown epilepsy type where tests have been performed and they've been exclusive, so that we have a type of epilepsy, but it's known not to be focal or generalized. There's still an open ticket about that, but we will add a class that represents that. We've reviewed the different epilepsies by etiologies, and the place where we left off is the epilepsy syndromes, and that's what we're going to continue to talk about today. But here's just a kind of a summary of what we've done so far. So there's actually over 300 epilepsy terms in Mondo, and these are not all distinct kind of leaf nodes, if you will. There's some of them are grouping classes that group together classes, so there's not necessarily terms you would annotate to, like the grouping classes are just kind of there to group together more specific classes, but 346 epilepsy disease terms is a lot. So I think it's an impressive number of terms, and been really helpful to go through these kind of almost one by one to try to get a sense of, are these appropriate terms? Are they still used? Do we need these terms? So in our work that we've done so far in the last two workshops, we've added so far 23 new terms. So that's a nice contribution to the ontology. We've looked at classifications in specific areas, like in the immune epilepsies, the genetic epilepsies. There's still open questions about that. We proposed a new classification of how to represent genetic epilepsies in the last workshop, and we're still working through that. We're going to actually meet with Chris Mungle, who's the original creator of the Mondo disease ontology and one of the PIs, just to review the proposal with him. So that's still kind of underway. We've added new branches in the generalized epilepsies, and we've worked through some of the epilepsy syndromes. I'll give you a summary in a second. And there's still a few open questions, but hopefully we'll get through all of that today. We've proposed merging some terms together where two terms have been deemed to be duplicates. So we've done a couple of mergers so far, and there's still a few open mergers that will be done. And then we proposed obsoleting some terms as well. One of the big groups of terms that we're going to obsolete are the electroclinical syndromes. For the last workshop, we decided those are more kind of phenotypic representations and not something that we really necessarily need. We did obsolete, I think, absence seizures because that was deemed to be a phenotype and not necessarily a disease. So yeah, a lot of work has been done so far, and more is underway. And like I said, in the next few months, hopefully at the very latest, we'll have all of this kind of um, done, and we'll be able to kind of look at and kind of look at the final product and then fine tune. So yeah, today we're going to continue looking at the epilepsy syndromes. So a lot of work has been done based on the work we talked about last time. So last time we reviewed the terms in Mondo and updated the children per ILAE. So we implemented some changes to the branches in orange. So the childhood onset, neonatal, infantile onset, and the variable age onset. We've implemented some changes to those. So I'll just show you what we've done so far. So the childhood onset, so we added a bunch of new terms here. Those are kind of represented in the stats I just showed you. So we already had the childhood onset epilepsy syndrome, but then we added some of these are kind of grouping classes, it looks like. So the self-limited focal epilepsy syndromes were added. We had some of these. We added one new term here. We have a genetic generalized epilepsy syndrome that grouped these terms together. We added the childhood onset idiopathic generalized epilepsy syndrome that groups the childhood absence epilepsy, and added this childhood onset epilepsy syndrome with developmental and or epileptic encephalopathy, and added one new term here. So this is the childhood onset epilepsy branch. We also, and then one merger was done with the epilepsy with myoclonic atonic seizures. So we had two terms here, the myoclonic ecstatic epilepsy and the myoclonic atonic. We merged these together and created just this one term, the myoclonic atonic epilepsy, which is a child of this new DEE type term. And we kept the label, the myoclonic atonic epilepsy, and used the synonym out of the synonym from the ILAE. And then we also did some work on the neonatal infantile epilepsy syndrome branch, added these two new grouping classes and a couple new children terms here. Yeah, this new early infantile DEE term was added. And in some of the subsequent slides today, we'll talk more about the DEEs. And we also added this new variable age onset epilepsy syndrome and grouped a lot of these classes, added some new classes in here and grouped a lot of these classes together based on the representation in ILAE, which we all agreed upon in the last workshop. So one question that came up when we were adding these new terms into Mondo, these new syndromic terms, is the relationship between epilepsy and the epilepsy syndromes. So what was in Mondo already is that we had epilepsy and an epilepsy syndrome as a child. And then we added these new terms, variable age onset, or this one was existing, but these were existing, the variable age onset epilepsy syndrome and the childhood onset epilepsy syndrome we had. And then we added these new terms as children, like the variable age onset focal epilepsy syndrome and childhood onset self-limited focal epilepsy syndrome. So when we added these, Sabrina pointed out that these should be children. The focal epilepsy syndrome should also be a child of focal epilepsy. So I just want to make sure we're all in agreement about that. This makes sense to me. I didn't initially think to do this, and then Sabrina pointed out that this is how we should represent this. And this makes sense as we have epilepsy. Oops, where did you go? Since we have epilepsy syndrome as a child of epilepsy, the focal epilepsy syndrome should be a child of focal epilepsy as well. kind of following the same kind of logic. Does anyone have any disagreements with this? Okay.
Heidi, go ahead. Heidi has her hand up.
Oh, thanks.
We're talking syndromic, so
Mhm.
I wonder if it gets more complicated later, where you look at children of genetic with the self-limiting.
Mhm.
And that's so I don't want to ask a question if we're going to get that, like KCNQ2,
Mhm.
those some of that population eventually they don't have their seizures. They might have infantile spasms, but then not develops seizures, and they
Mhm.
have the neurodevelopmental comorbidities.
Mhm.
So that I'm not a neurologist, but that
Yeah.
this makes sense based on the way that it's defined, the terms that are used. But is there a self-limiting one for the epilepsy and the itself for the genetic?
I'm
Jackie,
not sure.
Jackie just hopped on here. I don't
Oh,
know if
good.
I don't know if she
Yeah.
just heard all of that though, but
Yeah,
she
I
might
didn't hear the question, so
that.
if you could
Sorry.
just try and rephrase it, I might be able to answer it.
Sorry to
We're
put you
look
on the spot, Jackie, as soon as you get on.
we were looking at the, and again, as I'm not a neurologist, but we were looking at the self-limiting focal syndromic, and I probably got the terms out of out
Select.
of
It's
it.
Yeah.
select. Yes. What
Eh,
about it?
well, I was asking whether there's a similar terminology for genetic epilepsies, if there's a childhood self-limiting where the children have like KCNQ2, not all of that
No,
population.
no. For the monogenetic epilepsies, no. Select is a very specific syndrome that is genetic. It's very highly genetic. The gene I don't think is known, and it is not a developmental and epileptic encephalopathy, and it's not a monogenetic epilepsy, and it refers to a very specific syndrome. So it's, children show up with a highly recognizable EEG pattern, and can either be temporal. It used to be called, maybe this will help you. It used to be called benign Rolandic epilepsy. Does that sound at all familiar?
Yes,
So the
that
kid,
sounds familiar.
so the kids show up with, at a very specific age, with a very specific recognizable EEG pattern. They may have one or two seizures, and then they stop having seizures. They never have another one. They get treated for a short period of time, but essentially they all remit. So, that is a very specific thing, and it doesn't relate to any of the monogenetic epilepsies.
Okay, so
But related to this,
I get my question. Go ahead, Dana. I mean, what I'm trying to ask is, are we differentiating the monogenetic epilepsies for those patients that have the neurodevelopmental aspects but not the seizures? So they have them early, and then they are do not, because like there's several genetic epilepsies that like 40 or 50% of the patients have epilepsies,
Oh
things that
yeah,
are
for
called.
sure, for sure. Like Angelman syndrome and Fragile X syndrome, others like that. That's what you're talking about.
so
Yeah.
Heidi,
And
just to
even grin-related epilepsy, about half of them, I think, have seizures, or maybe a little more than half.
so just to clarify, for example, for SCN2A, there is this, in research we call them often selfie. These are self-limiting epilepsies. They have one seizure and that's it, and they can be in a family where there's people who have like a benign infantile epilepsy. There's differences even.
Select
Some of
is
these
that
and some of these terms have been, you know, an IDE endorsed and others not so much.
Yeah.
So-
The difference between that situation and select, I think, is that with select, which is a specific syndrome, all the kids remit. Whereas with a lot of these genetic epilepsies, you have seizures early on, you don't know whether they're going to remit or not. So it's not that the syndrome itself, you know, tells you they are going to remit.
yeah.
Is
And there
there,
are a few. There are a few. I will say there's KCNQ2 is one where most of them stop seizing after the, I think, the infantile stage. But I wouldn't call that self-limiting. Well, you know,
Yeah, so often these terms are given later on, so they're not given in, you know, in the acute phase. They're then retrospectively assigned once they don't develop the DEE, and so that's why they're more like in the research world. So they are these.
yeah,
Yeah,
that's kind of what I was saying is that, you know, it's not a prediction forward, it's
yeah,
a description backwards.
yeah.
That makes sense. Jackie, the question that came up before, I think right before you joined was, so we have this term, we have selects here, and then it's a type of focal epilepsy syndrome. But then we also added this focal epilepsy syndrome is a child of focal epilepsy. Does that make sense? Does it make sense to say selects is a type of focal epilepsy?
Select is a focal epilepsy. I mean, it's
Okay.
considered to be a focal epilepsy.
Okay, so that's what we have here. So I think this representation makes sense then. And that was a great discussion. We'll go back and make sure we look through all the notes and look against the ontology and make sure everything that you mentioned is represented properly in the ontology. Okay, let me move forward. So yes, I just briefly summarized what we had done before, looking at the childhood onset, the neonatal infantile onset, and the variable age onset. We did not last time have a chance to talk about the other types of epilepsy syndromes, and so I'd like to go through these one by one and discuss how we want to classify these in Mondo going forward. So first, we'll start with the adult onset epilepsy syndrome. So this was previously a grouping term that was, I think, in the ILAE. There's a note on the term that says this is an older way of classifying diseases, and then it links to the ILAE, but it's no longer in the ILAE. So I propose that we obsolete this grouping class and reclassify these children elsewhere, in the ontology, if they're not already classified elsewhere. So does anyone feel that we need to keep this adolescent onset epilepsy syndrome term? Is it something that's used in any of your communities, or are we okay with obsoleting it?
I'm okay. It's not in the ILAE, then it's fine.
Okay, great. We'll go ahead and mark that for
I don't,
obsolation. Oh,
I
yeah.
don't, so I don't know, it's not in the ILE, I know that's not used there. The one
Yeah.
weird thing about the adolescent onset is it oftentimes in the genetic syndromes, the
Uh-huh.
adolescent like puberty onset is very common. I just don't know if they would use this versus something else.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Are these diseases listed here? Like,
No,
I-
that mean like how it would be used, and I would that's not how it would be
Yeah,
used.
again,
Yeah.
that
Doesn't make any sense.
an adolescent onset syndrome would be one that always starts in adolescence.
Yeah.
In
Yeah.
those
So,
cases, it doesn't always.
yeah, so
Okay.
it wouldn't be the syndrome. It would be that the epilepsy was onset at adolescence. So yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Sounds good. There's several of these. So then we also have adolescent adult onset. Same thing. Was previously used in the ILAE, but it's no longer. So I propose obsoleting this one as well. This one looks like it's already been marked for obsolescence. So if there's no objections, we can just proceed with obsoleting this term. And these terms are also classified elsewhere. So this will have very little effect on the classifications. And then we have epileptic encephalopathy, infantile or early childhood. So this is a term that's just in OMIM, but it's no longer in OMIM. So I propose obsoleting this class as well, since it's no longer used. If anyone,
I mean, it's been replaced with DEE, right?
I think so.
Yeah, I think so
yeah.
too.
Yeah. Okay. I was in the conversations with Anna when they decided to rename. I don't remember what it's called before, when they decided to rename to DEE though.
Yeah, it is. And you know, for genetic purposes, makes sense to split them then later on in onset, you know, infantile, childhood, and so on.
Mm,
But this is
yeah.
like semi-endorsed from the early.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. And then we have infantile epilepsy syndrome, which has a lot of child classes. So this term is not in the ILE, but I think it's an orphanet, and it's grouping together all these orphanet terms. So all these terms with a star are grouped together based. These are all orphanet terms, and they're grouped together based on orphanet. So my question is, should we keep this term based on orphanet's usage, or obsolete it because it's not in the ILAE, and then we reclassify these as subtypes of neonatal infantile epilepsy syndrome?
I would vote for ILAE.
Okay.
Same, because if you look at them, they keep putting things together. And when you're
Mhm.
looking at ontologies, it's like you're pulling things together under one, and that's not going to work when you're trying to classify it.
Yeah. Okay. Sounds good. I'm glad we have a consensus on that.
Yeah, because all of them,
Um,
as soon as you put with, it gets messy on this side.
yeah.
On this
Yeah.
side.
Yeah. Yeah. And then we also have infantile epilepsy syndrome and neonatal epilepsy syndrome. And I was wondering if we should combine these and just merge them into neonatal infantile epilepsy syndrome.
I would
I
avoid this from a
Yeah, I
genetic
felt like we talked about this before.
you know, there's so I think so from a so it's moving into the so just looking a little bit of where things are going. It seems to be that there are different genetic etiologies, even if it's in the same gene, based on disease mechanism, which separate those who have neonatal seizures versus 6 months or 4 months or 1 year. These are different entities.
Okay, so no to merging these.
From my side, yes.
Okay,
No, against. So I'm
Yeah.
pro against.
yeah, I got it. Yeah, I felt like we talked about this before. Then I went back to the notes and I didn't see any definitive answer. So yeah, good to know. Okay, that's what I thought. So we will not merge these. And then we have, okay, this is a little bit complicated. So there's self-limited familial neonatal seizures, which is here. Are you able to see my pointer, I hope? Versus self-limited familial neonatal epilepsy, which is, so one of these is a child of neonatal infantile epilepsy syndrome, and the other one's a child of infantile onset epilepsy, which is not syndromic. So ClinGen had asked for these non-syndromic forms of the self-limited neonatal and infantile epilepsies. So I think because ClinGen requested these, and I'm glad, Sudip, we have you here from ClinGen. I don't know if you were on this original ticket, but I think ClinGen wanted to differentiate between the syndromic and the non-syndromic form. So I think this is something
Well,
that
would the
we,
non-syndromic just be focal epilepsy? Or are they talking about, like, I think benign neonatal convulsions is a syndrome. I'm not a pediatric epileptologist, so I'm a
yeah,
little, but I mean, are they talking about just focal epilepsy being non-syndromic?
or it's a
I can't think of
self-limited.
another,
Yeah,
or are they just talking about DEE not otherwise specified, which of course probably can happen at any age? And do we have a category for DEE not otherwise specified, or what do we do with those people? I mean, they're too young to have, Lennox-Gastaut. Some of them are going to be called Ohtahara syndrome, but I presume
yeah.
they're just going to be some messy, bad epilepsy. I don't know what caused it, and I don't know what's going to happen to this kid.
Ohtahara syndrome has been assigned as a synonym for another term, and I can't remember off the top of my head, but it is in the slide deck somewhere. I think we actually did obsolete O'Hara syndrome and merge it into something else. But we'll
I think
get
it
to
has
that.
another name now.
Yeah,
yeah.
we'll get to it. It's in here somewhere. I just don't remember right now.
But you know, like not everybody's going to meet the criteria for O'Hara is what I'm saying. It could just be
Uh-huh.
a bad
Yeah.
neonatal, you know, bad brain, neonatal bad brain. Like you
Oh,
know, they had encephalitis and now they're just seizing all over the place.
yeah.
It's not a syndrome.
Uh-huh.
It's just
Yeah.
sort of a DEE not otherwise specified. So
Yeah.
if they want a category for that, I think we should always have a category for DEE not otherwise specified.
And you think that's what kind of is over here in blue? This infantile onset?
I would guess that it could be focal not otherwise specified or DEE not otherwise specified.
Yeah.
I also wonder if the syndrome comes maybe from the family, not from the individual. If you think about like a KCNQ2 family, like which was mentioned before,
Mm-hmm.
that the syndrome is defined not in that individual, but because there are like 5 other family members who have epilepsy due to KCNQ2, which is then self-limiting in that individual, you know, but I don't know, just guessing.
Yeah.
But we move anyways in the direction that at some point we call it KCNQ2 related epilepsy, so that would solve that then. But
What was the, so this was the request from ClinGen?
Yeah,
And
ClinGen had asked
is
for
it presented
it's
in
not.
Clin-
What's that?
what's an example from ClinGen that it's represented, that how it would be represented there?
They asked for this term, infantile onset epilepsy. That's a non-syndromic form. And
No,
then
meaning
the-
like
oh.
where like they created it from data, right? So that they
Mhm.
put it there. What kind of data kind of brought them to request this?
Oh,
Question. Because if
let me see if I
examples
can get
like
back to find-
what Dennis and Jackie gave, it might clarify it a little bit as to the purpose of that versus like what Jackie was saying, it would make more sense to put it in a DE not otherwise specified.
so I could just guess,
Yeah.
you know, if you have someone with a family background, the chances are that your genetic test is positive is way higher, right? For like, if you have like 3 family members which have a history of KCNQ2, you could call it a syndrome. If you do a test and you have someone with epilepsy in front of you, chances are that that person is positive is very high. If it would be a non-syndromic, you know, child with a focal epilepsy, chances are very low. And so I don't know, and if that is because ClinGen, right, genetics, that comes from that direction.
Then it feels like we're confusing familial and syndromic, which are 2 different things.
That's true.
Mhm.
But the problem is with these, for example, KCNQ2 is you can have people with a DEE and you can have people also like a developmental epileptic encephalopathy and a milder version, which is not having these additional features in the same family. So that, you know.
Sure, I mean, that is probably true of everything, right? Like every neonatal seizure, there's always a disorder. There's always a case report of someone who had a first seizure at age 2.
That's true. So that's, you know.
Here's one other request from ClinGen, some of the context of where they're coming from. So, infantile period seizures, complete or nearly complete seizure remission afterwards, usually good developmental outcome, dominant transmission with high penetrance of pedigrees. Does this answer your question, Vanessa?
Yeah, but it doesn't actually make it any clearer, to be honest.
I think there's a few different requests from them in this area, infantile onset. Epilepsy starting at 12 months of life. Yeah, they asked for these other terms to be children of the infantile onset epilepsy versus the syndromes, because there's a difference between syndromic and non-syndromic disorders. Yeah, so the question really is, do we want to have these separate non-syndromic and syndromic branches? And should we kind of mirror this in both branches, having the self-limited epilepsy, neonatal and infantile syndromic forms along with the non-syndromic forms?
I mean, I just think that there should be a place for DEE not otherwise specified, because I think,
Yeah,
you know, studies have shown that it's like 40% of all DEEs.
yeah. There are slides on DEEs coming up, so we will get to that shortly. I don't know if we have
Nicole,
an answer. Yeah,
maybe a path forward would be to be in touch with the ClinGen working group who requested
yeah,
that term and
yeah,
ask them for more explanation and looking at the data that they use to
perfect.
to get
Sounds good.
that to ask for that term.
Yeah, sounds good. Let's do that. Okay, let's see what's next. So yeah, we'll follow up with ClinGen about this. Okay, we will get to DEE shortly. Before that, we have Moynihan syndrome. So this one, epilepsy is a feature of this disease, and this classification comes from Orphanet. So I propose to take this out of the epilepsy branch and reclassify it as a Mendelian disease, unless anybody thinks of this as a type of epilepsy. Does anyone feel that way?
Never heard of it.
Okay. Yeah. So Orphanet often groups diseases together based on features, which is a different approach that we take in Mondo. So that's why this ended up here. So okay, a few more questions before we get to DEEs, but so this is a kind of a big question that I'll have kind of apply across different other branches of Mondo as well. So in the case of syndromic disorders like this one here, where we have two different types of phenotypic representations combined into a syndrome. So we have spinal muscular atrophy and progressive myoclonic epilepsy syndrome. Should this just be classified as a child of syndromic disease, or would it be a child of the two major features of this disease, spinal muscular atrophy, and a child of monoclonic epilepsy or myoclonic epilepsy? Does anyone have opinions about that? This is kind of a ontology modeling question, but as researchers and epilepsy experts using Mondo, would you expect to be able to find a disease like this in the spinal muscular atrophy branch or the myoclonic epilepsy branch, or just finding it in the syndromic disease branch? Would that make sense?
I think I would want to see it in the myoclonic epilepsy branch, I think.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, for me, always was my understanding that that Mondo is trying to be more holistic, disease focused, whereas HBO would be more focused on symptoms.
Yeah, exactly.
And if, for example, myoclonic seizures are a core syndrome, and this needs to be based on prevalence of some kind of frequency of spinal muscular atrophy, then I would say it should be should be implied by the spinal muscular atrophy label. But if it's just a rare event that what maybe happens in 1 out of whatever 50 or 100 patients, then they should get the double label of the epilepsy and the spinal muscular atrophy. But because otherwise you run into becoming HBO.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, Sabrina, how do you feel about this? If we classified, I think Peter was the one that posed this
I
too.
think this is a recurring questions that we have in terms of how syndromes should be defined. So in general, epilepsy syndromes, do we mean, what is the definition of an epilepsy syndrome? Is it a syndrome where one of the feature is epilepsy, or is it a syndrome where the major feature is epilepsy? And I think we go back and forth, and it depends on who the person looking at it is, and the expertise. So I think this is why this question comes, and the same questions comes again and again. I think it would be great to know from your expert opinion. When you think of epilepsy syndrome, do you think that the major feature is epilepsy, or do you think epilepsy is one of the feature, but might not be the major one? So that would be great to have any opinions on that.
There's even data on this. So there's a survey which I presented at the Rare Epilepsy Network meeting. This was like 2 months ago, and where you ask 140 rare epilepsy groups. Each of them have like 50 to 1,000 members with a genetic epilepsy. What fraction of people in your community have epilepsy, right? So and these are called rare epilepsy, epilepsies as a label. And the range is only 70%. So you have for a rare epilepsy community, let's call it a gene disorder or a syndrome like Dravet syndrome, it ranges. But you have, for example, problems like GI and other things which have often higher rates than the epilepsy or developmental delay. It really depends on who you talk to. If you talk to epileptologists, of course, they will say, it's the epilepsy. But if you talk to a behavior specialist, they will call it an autism gene or whatever. So it's really, but since you're talking here to the epilepsy group, it's probably, you get the epilepsy version answer of this. It's really important. That's really depends on who you talk to.
I will back up Jen on that one too, because I'm like the data that he's talking about, we collected, and it's very, very clear that it needs to be it needs to be the constellation, because it's very true that when we look at some of these groups, it's like the epilepsy is low and everything else is really high.
And it would be good to hear Mondo guidance, how you approach this in general. Is it for you, from your perspective, it has to be 30% of the community, it has to be 90% of the community, it has to be whatever 1%, and it's because at the moment it's completely anarchy, and it's just how you how someone has opinion, but it would be good to know how Mondo defines it.
Yeah,
and at this point we get so many different ideas from a lot of different experts, and these ideas are very different depending on the domain. So we are trying to figure out what the rules of, how do we make decisions. We want to, we need to hear this, to have these discussions with more people, so that we can make that decision in a way that makes the most sense.
Can I interject
somebody
here for a second and say, in the epilepsy classification, there is syndrome and there is cause, and the two are two different branches of the classification. So just because you have SCN8A, there are some etiologies that have been made into syndromes, as you know, like CDD, is now a syndrome, and there's a couple of others, but most of them are not syndromes, they're causes. And within the people with those causes, they might have Lennox-Gastaut, they might have Odahara or something else, or they would have DEE not otherwise specified. So just because you have a gene that causes epilepsy doesn't mean that is your syndrome.
Yeah. Curtis, you have your hand up.
I guess I was going to say that similar things, again, as a biochemical geneticist point of view, so not a neurologist, but to me, when conditions are often defined by epilepsy, like I'll say, for example, SSADH deficiency, that's something that we think of as they often have epilepsy. We look for the epilepsy, it's defined by the epilepsy, but actually recent studies show it's only about 60% of patients have epilepsy, but still it's something that is like innate to the disease. I'd want to see it there. Something like SMA, where although there have been almost 50 patients ever reported with epilepsy, it's much less than 1% of all SMA patients. I don't think of it as, it happens. That there should be some note of that, but I don't think of it as a epilepsy syndrome. But just my clinician hat on. Speaking of clinicians, I have to sign out a patient in a few minutes. I'm really sorry about that, and I'll try to join back if my sign out goes really quick.
Thanks, Curtis. Thank you for joining. All right, so I don't know if we've reached any kind of consensus on the syndromic diseases. Sounds like we still need to figure out a better, proper way to define syndromic epilepsies. This maybe needs to be kind of more of an ongoing discussion.
Yeah, that's right, Nicole. I think we could probably move on for this moment.
Okay, sounds good. I do have one question though, before we do move on, about myoclonic epilepsy. And several instances, it seems like it would be useful to have a myoclonic epilepsy grouping class because we have myoclonic epilepsy in infancy, juvenile, familial, adult. Would this be a valid term, just a general myoclonic epilepsy term?
I mean, you have to subdivide into the progressive myoclonic epilepsies and the idiopathic generalized epilepsies with myoclonus.
Okay. But if we had the myoclonic, we could have those as subclasses. Would that make sense? And then we'd have these
Yes, yes, I think so.
onset types. Okay, cool. I will add that as a potential new term request. Okay. Next we have, and this is another example of how to represent syndromic diseases. So I'll just share this example, but then this is going to be something that we can think about further. So here's another one where we have 3 different types of dominant phenotypes presented in this disease, where you have cerebellar ataxia, epilepsy, and intellectual disability. It's currently classified as a monogenic epilepsies per Orphanet and an autosomal recessive cerebellar ataxia. And then there's several subclasses. So yeah, the question is, should this actually be a child of monogenic epilepsy, given that the epilepsy is kind of a component of this and not the only feature of this? But it sounds like we want to spend some more time thinking about how to represent syndromic diseases like this. And this is much more far-reaching outside of epilepsies. It will affect the whole representation in Mondo. And Dennis, thank you for bringing up that point that we kind of need to agree upon a approach to how to do this, because this is something that's been on our radar for a long time. And I agree, this is something we need to think about more carefully. So that's just another example, but we'll continue on with our other key terms of interest. So yes, there's several classes. We're doing well on time, which is great. I know, Jeff, we have you for another half an hour. So here we are at the DEEs. So there's several questions that have come up in here, and what I'm hearing is that we probably need a DEE, not otherwise specified class, which I don't think we definitely don't have a term that's named exactly that. I don't know if there's something that's close to that, but let's take a look at what we have so far. So we have a DEE, kind of general class. It's currently a child of neonatal infantile epilepsy syndrome. We've already discussed this a little bit and determined that this, one, it should not be a Mendelian disease necessarily, and also it also shouldn't be, from my research, it looks like it shouldn't be a neonatal infantile epilepsy syndrome. The general class shouldn't be a child of this, although there are specific subtypes of DEE that are neonatal or infantile onset. So what I propose here is to create a new generic DEE class that's not Mendelian. That could be a child of complex neurodevelopmental disorder and or epilepsy, and then rename the existing DEE class to hereditary DEE and make that a child of the generic DEE. I think I might have a diagram. No.
Yes.
Okay. Yes. Okay. Good.
Yes.
There'll be a diagram soon somewhere in my slides. So yeah, based on some text in the ILAE, they said it's basically can be applied to individuals of any age, so it should not be a child of neonatal infantile syndrome. So we'll remove that assertion. So yeah, here's my diagram. So yeah, so we'll add this new term, the generic DEE, then have the existing term be renamed to hereditary DEE.
Yeah, I'm going to tell you that I don't agree with this entirely. I just don't think that an adult can develop a DEE because they're not developing anymore. So how can they develop a DEE? You know, like they have you know, cognitive dysfunction and bad epilepsy, but it's not developmental anymore. I'm just saying.
We have a child onset one. I can't remember if we decided on that, because they, in addition to your quote there, they also characterize it in that paper as a group of rare and severe neurologic disorders that manifest in early childhood, but don't give a date on it. So back to like Jackie's thing, it's not adulthood, but they say early childhood, and then the characterization of developmental delays, regression, seizures, and cognitive impairment. So if we have parents that are neonatal infantile onset and then possibly childhood onset, that could be where they live. But yeah, back to Jackie's point, you wouldn't put it under adult onset or
Right,
adolescent onset either.
Yeah, this is great. I feel like this is all great content we can discuss in the paper too. So this representation doesn't give it any kind of age restriction though. That's a great point about the quote, not necessarily.
It has to have the developmental delay or regression and cognitive, like it has to have that based upon the ILA definition.
Okay. So do these parents make sense then? Does the complex neurodevelopmental disorder capture that properly? This is what the current, currently it's a child of the complex neurodevelopmental disorder, and then it's inferred to be a Mendelian neurodevelopmental disorder, which will change if we make this hereditary. The hereditary will be the child of the Mendelian neurodevelopmental disorder.
There was just a paper published by there's a number of authors, including Helen Cross, Ingrid Sheffer, Stefano Van, Nicola Specula, and me, which goes into further detail on what a DEE is, an operational definition of DEE. And there may be an age in there. So even though I'm an author, I should know the answer. I can't remember exactly if there was.
If anybody can let me pull it up. I'll pull it up. I think I just sent it to somebody.
Oh, thanks, Vanessa. Yeah, we'll definitely take a look.
There was a lot of debate. I will tell you, there was a lot of argument and debate among us about, I basically was the one who said this paper should exist because nobody really knows what a DEE is. And, Ingrid and Helen said, oh, everybody knows. And then once we started talking, it was clear that even we amongst ourselves didn't know. But the example that I gave was exactly what I was talking about before. A child who has a severe insult in infancy, like a severe infection, trauma, something like that, or a migrational disorder, and has a very disrupted brain and therefore is cognitively delayed and has bad epilepsy. Would that be a DEE? And some people thought it would, and some people thought it wouldn't. And I think that I'm not exactly sure how to handle this here. Maybe we can just bypass it, because if that was true, then your definition there, if it's not a DEE, your definition wouldn't be sufficient. They basically added that part of the cognitive dysfunction could be as a result of the epileptic activity. That's sort of the understanding. And I can't remember how we put it in the paper. So if you, if you want to look at the paper, it might clarify that so that you can get that definition a little sharper.
Yeah, we'll definitely look at the paper. Thank you. Heidi?
Well, if I could ask a silly question of the geneticists, I don't know that hereditary is correct. The genetic rare epilepsies are not necessarily hereditary. The mutations can be de novo or spontaneous. So I don't know if that wording is appropriate.
So 90% of what we call genetic epilepsy, clinically diagnosable genetic epilepsies are sporadic and de novo. 90%, even probably 95%.
This is something that we're going to discuss further with Chris Mungle of how we really want to define these types of genetic diseases. I think this is going to be kind of a more broader, far-reaching kind of question.
Including if you don't do genetic testing, the developmental epileptic encephalopathy. So if you just call them by phenotype, they would be sporadic in 90% of the cases.
Yeah. If they're sporadic, though, they still can be passed on.
No, the disease is typically so strong under evolutionary selection that there's fecundity, so they cannot have children often.
Yeah. So Omen has these phenotypic series where they group together all the subtypes of a disease that are based on the monogenic mutations. So that's kind of where this hereditary DE comes from, because there's all these subtypes that are in OMIM.
Yeah, but doesn't make
Rather
sense.
than,
So
rather
it's not a representation what we have learned the last years.
okay.
So what I would like to learn, and because I think we talked about this last time, but forgot again. So because also Jackie is here as an adult neurologist. So someone might have has is called DE by a pediatrician or a pediatric neurologist. However, that person shows up by the age of 45 in an adult clinic and has a very complex epilepsy with lives in an assisted living facility and has a lot of comorbidities, movement disorders, whatever. Is it still fair by the so does Mondo want to call it still like a DE or
yes, it's still a DEE.
Okay.
As far as we call it, yes.
Okay. And it fits.
Okay. So
it's the age of onset rather than the age of the person at that particular point.
Okay.
Okay, so it sounds like we're undecided about this representation. I will look at Jackie's paper. We're questioning the use of the hereditary label. This maybe will get answered when we think more about. Thank you for the paper. Here's the paper.
That's one of them that talks about ages. I'm not
Okay.
sure if it's exactly the same one, but this is one of the Helen Cross, Jackie French ones. But there could be other ones out there, but this is one that does talk about
Yeah,
age.
that's not the one I'm talking
I don't
about.
think that isn't the one that I've sent it to other people, but not this is not the one. I can't find the one that I sent recently. But this one does have this one does address age in a figure 1.
Okay.
I think the other one is
Not out
online ahead of print.
yet. Okay.
Or maybe it was just accepted and it's not even online yet.
Okay,
So
Okay.
if I find it, I'll send it to you.
Okay, thank you, Jackie. Yeah, so there's still open questions about the use of the hereditary label. There's still a lot of open questions too about DEs. If you don't mind, we'll look at these other questions too. And yeah, it looks like we'll have to come back and revisit some of these and come to consensus. But so yeah, so there's a number of DEs that come from OMIM, and these correspond to particular genetic variants. And then there's Dravet syndrome that was requested to be a child of DEE per the FinGen epilepsy gene curation expert panel. Does this seem, is everyone on board with this? There's no controversy here. Okay.
No,
good.
it is definitely a DEE.
Okay, good. This is a few years ago. Yeah, issue number 745. I think we're on like issue like 8,000 now or something. That was a very long time ago. So yeah, this is how we have Dravet syndrome represented. So it was requested to be a child of DEE by ClinGen, and then ILAE classifies it under this neonatal infantile onset epilepsy syndrome with developmental, I think it was and/or actually in the label, developmental and/or epileptic encephalopathy. So just an FYI that this I created this new class in the last revision, and now Dravet syndrome is a child of this new term. We also created this new early infantile DEE term, and then currently I think Dravet syndrome is just a child of developmental of the generic G or the DEE class that we have, and it's to be determined if we want to kind of represent it this way.
And here's a good example where the Dravet syndrome is not inherited. So there might be two families on this planet which have where this is somehow reported in the literature, but this is not inherited.
Okay, this isn't currently implemented. This is a proposal. So right now, Dravet syndrome is just a child of DEE directly. So
Dennis, I have a question for you. What about the families with GEFS plus? I always thought that they could pop out a DEE at some point or other, or a Dravet.
Typically not. So there's like there's a lot of challenges in defining if the variant which was found in a person with a febrile seizure in the SCN1A gene is really causative. And from today's perspective, the GEFS plus families are relatively homogeneous, but sometimes there are individuals who are pharmacoresistant, and sometimes ultra rare. They have also some delays, because it's a continuum what's happening in SCN1A. But but typically Dravet syndrome is not part of such families.
Thank you. That's very helpful.
Yeah, thanks. Okay, moving on to some of the other children. We have hemiplegic migraine developmental and epileptic encephalopathy spectrum. This is required to be a child of DEE per ClinGen, so I say there's no action needed here. We have LGS. This is also proposed to be a child of DEE per Paretlo, who is part of the Include project, which is for representing, it's a repository for Down syndrome. And also, she said she'd have this discussion with an expert who proposed this. Jackie, you're an expert in LGS too, right? So I don't know if you have any comments on this. So yeah, my question is, should LGS be a child of a generic DEE? It's not a genetic disease, is that right?
It can be, but it isn't always. I mean,
Yeah.
now we know that the LGS group has a genetic disease. Dennis, you're going to have to correct me if I'm wrong. 30% of the time, and probably many of the rest of them do, but we haven't found the gene yet, or it's polygenetic or whatever. But monogenetic that has yet been discovered in a third.
I agree.
Okay.
So it can be, but but it should not be a child, right? So in this case, so if I understand, so some DEs develop to become LGL, Lennox-Gastaut syndrome, but you can also have non-genetic etiologies. You can have other reasons how you to convert to Lennox-Gastaut syndrome, which are not DE related.
Yeah, and it should be childhood onset, not child.
Yeah. Looks like it is a child of childhood. It's a child of childhood onset epilepsy syndrome, but it's also a child of, or a subclass of the childhood onset epilepsy syndrome with developmental and/or epileptic
Right, but as Dennis
encephalopathy.
pointed out, I see plenty of Lennox-Gastaut patients in my adult epilepsy clinic, and they still have Lennox-Gastaut.
But do you think it's childhood? They have the onset in childhood, or they?
Exactly, childhood onset, but it doesn't remit. So
okay, yeah.
Yeah, and I think you can even have external insults which put you later on in the Lennox-Gastaut category, which are not non-syndromic.
So do we want to remove Lennox-Gastaut as a child of DEE or the?
Yeah, a childhood onset DEE, not a child with.
Oh,
but Dennis, in regards to your comment, I mean, it gets back to if they're no longer in the developmental ages, like if they're a teenager, then it's hard to say that they have a developmental encephalopathy. They have an encephalopathy and they have epilepsy. It rarely somebody develops something that looks exactly like Lennox-Gastaut when they're an adolescent. It's extremely rare. So I wouldn't even worry about that too much.
Okay.
I think this wording here is confusing. I think that child is in the ontology sense, it's like subclass. It's a subclass. But yeah, just to clarify, is it not appropriate to have LGS as a child?
Yeah, I wouldn't have the heading be children of DEE. That's a weird way to put it anyway. What does that even mean?
Oh, a subclass.
I think it means ontological children. So we use
I got it.
Sorry.
Okay, never mind. Never mind.
Yeah,
it's not a child. It's not a child.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's going to confuse somebody else other than me, I think.
Yeah, sorry about that.
It has been. There's the hereditary aspect and the children aspect has been a point of discussion on these calls.
Yes, we use child as like a term in ontology, like Dravet syndrome is a child of DE or subclass. So I'll try to use subclass instead of child. But
yeah, why can't you use subclass? That's so much more clear.
Yeah, I'll use that going forward. But so LGS is not always a type of DE then? Is that
Yes,
right?
it is by definition a DEE, always.
Okay. Okay. Got it. Okay. Perfect. And then we also have microencephaly, seizures, and developmental delay. This is classified as a DEE per OMIM, so I think there's no
Nicole, if
action.
you exit out of the slides and reopen them, I edited the title so that it's not as.
Oh, thank you. Perfect. Appreciate that. Yeah, we get so used to using our terminology and don't really think about how it's interpreted elsewhere. Yeah, so this one, I think there's no action needed. Another multiple congenital anomalies, hypotonia, seizure syndrome 2. This is an OMIM classification, so unless there's any objections, I think this is okay. Neonatal onset developmental and epileptic encephalopathy was requested by ClinGen, so I think this one's okay. Another one requested by ClinGen. I think this one's okay, no action is needed. And non-neonatal early infantile epileptic encephalopathy is also requested by ClinGen. Looks like it's tagged for obsolescence. We might want to revisit that since it's probably being used by ClinGen, but so no action needed at the time. And then, yeah, just note here that we added this new early infantile DEE class. And we have generic, we have the generic DEE class. But this is the early infantile, and then there's the neonatal infantile epilepsy onset syndrome with DEE. The question here is if we want to merge early myoclonic encephalopathy with early infantile DEE. This is shown here. So this is the early infantile, early myoclonic encephalopathy is, so the definition of this term, the early infantile DEE says, and I think in ILAE it says that the synonym is this is the early infantile DEE, this is formerly known as early myoclonic encephalopathy. And then also the synonym for Ohtahara syndrome is on hereditary, or the synonym for Ohtahara syndrome is currently on the DEE class. But then in ILAE, they say that early infantile DEE is formerly Ohtahara syndrome. So the proposal is to move the synonym Ohtahara syndrome to the early infantile DEE and merge early myoclonic encephalopathy.
I would send an email to, I can't remember who was the author. Maybe the right person would be Ellen. Why am I blocking on her last name from the Mayo Clinic? Help me out. But I am not a pediatric epileptologist, and I just don't know whether whether Ohtahara syndrome is synonymous with early infantile DEE, or there can be other early infantile DEEs.
Yeah. Okay. So is he one
I
of the
would
authors? Is it Ellen Good?
Elaine Worrell. That's what I'm thinking of.
Elaine
Just my
Worrell.
brain.
Okay.
Elaine Worrell. I would just reach out to her.
Okay.
She would
Yeah,
know
that
the
sounds good.
answer in 5 seconds or less.
Okay, sounds good. Yeah, because there's this question about whether, the early infantile DEE is synonymous with these terms. That sounds good. I'll reach out to her. And there's also early myoclonic epilepsy or encephalopathy. This has the subclasses familial infantile myoclonic epilepsy and myoclonic epilepsy hard-tongue type. If we were to merge this one, well, yeah, it sounds like we should just reach out to the
or I
the
mean,
expert.
they wrote a paper where they outlined all of this, so you might be able to find the answer in the paper.
Okay.
If not, you can just reach out to her about those 2 points, and she should be able to direct you in the correct direction.
That sounds great. I will do that. One question came up too about this myoclonic epilepsy heart tongue type. Is this a legitimate disease? This is an omen, but there's only 2 papers that are referenced, and they're quite old, one from 1920 and one from 1965. I don't know if this is something that we should keep for legacy purposes, or if this is still, or if this is no longer considered a disease. Is this familiar to
Couldn't
anyone?
help you there. Couldn't
Okay.
help you there.
Yeah. Yeah. There's been some discussion about trying to obsolete some of these old terms from OMIM, but then also I see some value in keeping them in case anyone ever is referencing these. So oh, thank you so much, Vanessa, for that email address. That's great. I will follow up with Elaine about that. Let's see. Yeah, so this is a kind of similar question about maybe the Otahara syndrome synonym, but I'll follow up with Elaine about that. It's great to have these experts to help guide us. It's really wonderful. And then oh, so questions have come up too also about infantile epileptic spasms syndrome. So which is also one of the children in the neonatal infantile epilepsy syndrome branch. So the question about this one is this so currently we have West syndrome, but from the definition in the ILAE, it looks like the label should actually be infantile epileptic spasms syndrome, and then West syndrome should be a child. I've talked to Heidi about this before, but I just wanted to, and this to my child here, I mean subclass.
Elaine would also be a
Yeah.
good one for that one, by the way.
Yeah, I mean, I know
Okay,
that
She's
there
on
is,
the Spasms Action Network, so she's gonna be a good one to ask about that as well.
but I
Okay,
think I
excellent.
can possibly answer it even without Elaine, and that is that, yeah, now it is infantile spasms, and they can either be infantile onset or childhood
Oh,
onset.
okay. Okay.
So, people can have spasms. It became clear that children can have spasms beyond the infant age.
Uh-huh.
So now we
Okay.
have childhood spasms as well as infantile spasms.
Okay. So maybe we need a term too that's childhood epileptic spasms. And then does it make sense to have West syndrome as a subclass of infantile epileptic spasms?
Well, only as you said, for legacy purposes.
Okay, got it. Yeah,
A lot of people still use the term, even though it is no longer a term.
right. Got it. Okay, perfect. Okay. I think we just have a few slides left. This is great.
But maybe can you put in there that, like put in parentheses legacy so people know don't use this term?
Oh, definitely. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
We have a way of marking it that it's historic and no longer used. So yeah, we can definitely do that. Okay, I think I just have a few examples left of some disease versus phenotype terms. So yeah, I went and checked to see how much overlap we had. I looked to see if just kind of overlapping names between Mondo and HPO, and then also to see if we had any epilepsy terms that were cross-referencing HPO terms. We do that a lot. We have a lot. I don't know if people have used Mondo to the extent where you've noticed that there's a lot of terms that are present in both Mondo and in HPO, like things like anemia, for example, could be considered a disease or a feature of a disease or a phenotype. So I could just find a couple examples in Mondo where we had overlap with HPO. There might be other ones that I've missed, but just to go over a couple. Status epilepticus, is this a disease or is this a phenotype? I asked Google, and the AI overview said, yes, it's a disease. It provided some examples. Going through some of the more detailed kind of papers and stuff, it sounds more like to me like it's a phenotype.
I believe it's a phenotype.
Okay, that's kind of what I was concluding too. Anyone else have an opinion about that?
Yeah, but the only thing is, there are certain diseases where this is, and you have extreme versions of status epilepticus,
Uh-huh.
and I think so. So people move
It's still a symptom, though. I mean, I was thinking about Norse and fires, which are extreme examples, but Norse is the disease, fires is the disease, and the manifestation is the status epilepticus.
Yeah, exactly. So exactly. But I don't know if Norse and fires are covered yet. So that's why I wonder if.
We definitely have fires. I think Norse sounds familiar too.
Okay. Then
Yeah. Okay, great. And then the second one was epilepsia partialis continua, which from what I read, it sounds like it's a subtype of status epilepticus.
Correct.
So
Correct.
therefore, I would say it's not a disease as well.
Right. It's a
And-
manifestation of a disease.
Perfect.
It's a
Awesome.
type of seizure presentation.
Yeah, got it. That's it. That's all. Oh my gosh, we've gotten through
Good.
everything. Yes, amazing. It sounds like we still have a lot of open questions, a lot of work to follow up on, but this has been so immensely helpful to go through all this content with you all. So as next steps, yes, we're going to follow up with we'll listen to the recording, make sure we captured everything in the notes. We'll create tickets for all the things that we discussed. I have a lot of action items where I'm going to follow up with specific people to try to get specific answers. We still have some bigger questions that we want to address, like syndromes and how to represent genetic epilepsies. These are things we might not be able to do in a super short time frame, but it'll be something that we'll continue to work on. I think for the purposes of writing up a summary, though, we can, if we don't come to a consensus and conclusion on everything, we can still write up a paper. We'll have some open questions, which is totally fine. Maybe publishing a paper will spur more discussion from the community as well. Maybe we can get more input from others. So for the things that we did agree upon, we will come to consensus on. I will create GitHub issues to document all the proposed changes, and then we'll start working on implementing those. And I hope to get a lot of these major changes into the ontology within the next couple of months. So then this will be available for all of you to use. Like I said, the releases come out on the first Tuesday of every month. So I'm gonna aim for March. I usually don't try to give myself deadlines, but I really would love to see this get done. So I'm gonna go ahead and say that out loud. Of course, we'll keep you updated on the progress. And then, yes, we'll start to work on an outline for a paper. And we have so much good content now to discuss. We'll get a draft going and share it with everybody. We'll get in touch with you to collect authorship information and start working on, we'll create a Google Doc where we can all contribute to a draft. And yes, and like I said, we're going to create this kind of feedback form, which is kind of pretty sophisticated, I must say. That was developed by one of our amazing teammates, Julie McMurray. And when we have that, so we'll get the changes implemented in the next couple of months, and then we'll come up with this feedback form where you'll have additional opportunities to come in and provide your feedback. And I may have mentioned before that ontologies are always kind of an iterative process. So this isn't final. What we've come to consensus on today and concluded, we'll implement these changes, but we're always going to be updating the ontology. And someone I talked to, I was saying that we're trying to update it based on the ILAE classification that came out a couple of years ago. But now I understand there's another one that's, they're reworking another one, and they'll release a new classification sometime in the future. So we're always going to be continually trying to update and stay on top of the current representation and thinking of how epilepsy disease entities should be represented in the ontology. So this is never final, but we'll keep working together on this and keep doing the best we can to properly represent epilepsy in the best scientifically and medically accepted way. And the ability to work with the community has just been super wonderful for us, and we're really grateful for all of you. So I look forward to our next steps and getting these changes implemented and putting it together in manuscript and sharing this further with the community. And thank you all again so much for coming. And we get to end early today.